Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and friends beyond the binary. Welcome to Step Back Tonight. I'm your host, Tristan. Step Back Tonight is a weekly thing that I decided is a good idea to do, where I do a stream with you guys for an evening. We laugh, we love. I usually rant about capitalism for about 20 minutes at some point in the evening. Overall, we have a great time. You can find this show every Tuesday night from 7 until roughly 10-ish, but I let you guys know that is going to end a little early tonight. I'm right now really deep in the next Step Back video, and I want to get it done before I go to bed tonight because sponsors and such. So the video I'm working on the history of Brazil is going to be the subject of a late night. So I'm going to call the stream probably around 9, which is about an hour earlier than usual. Sorry. Hopefully there's no chicken-related upset from that, but someone's got to make the videos come out. And I'm sure you guys would all appreciate getting video on time rather than me yapping for another hour tonight. So for everybody who is out in the chat, if you're new to the chat, please say hello. The chat's always welcome and happy to see new faces show up and join in the conversation. And of course, my wonderful partner Kelly is on the line, making sure that everyone behaves himself in the chat, and of course, gathers up all of your questions so that I might answer them. I can see they're already starting to flood in, which is nice. I could talk about a couple things before we get started that kind of happened this week that'd be interesting to bring up. Let's see how wild the chat is, see if there's any new people. There's stuff. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit. First of all, Donald Trump has done a lot of things this week that have been interesting. And one of the things that I think I want to talk about the most is claimed at a rally that he wanted to cure, that he was going to cure AIDS. Which, he said he was going to cure cancer and AIDS. So that was his two plans. But, that's a hilarious thing to say. But then what happened is shortly after he said he was going to cure AIDS, it led to a spike in traffic on my AIDS crisis video, which I guess is good. But what a way to get attention to your video. People searching what AIDS is, I guess. I don't know. What's next? The New York Times has done a few doozies this week. One was good and one was bad. I don't know if you guys saw, but in the wake of the shootings that happened on the weekend, the New York Times made one of the most memorable headlines in saying that Trump urges unity against racism, which is not really a Trump thing to do. Go New York Times. But what I want to talk about a little bit actually was something else, which was, let's just find this thing. It was a New York Times interactive piece in which they did a analysis, like literally county by county in the United States, of all of the donorship to the different presidential candidates for the Democratic Party. based on who had the most donors rather than the biggest donors. So let me just take a looky. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a link to this interactive so you guys can look at it because it's really interesting. So that's a link to it. For anyone who wants to get just the TLDR of the map, Sanders owns the entire map. It isn't surprising because he has like almost double the donors of the second highest by like number of donors. So virtually every single place has has Sanders as backing him as the biggest backing, with like some tiny enclaves in different regions of the United States based specifically on who that person represents. So, interesting stuff. And when I was looking at this, I was thinking, what's the takeaway from this? Also, I should mention that on this list, there's one place where Sanders support is really, really low, and that is Washington, D.C., which is not a surprise at all. But like, if you look at the map, you can see like Biden has support in like Delaware, and Buttigieg has support in like Indiana, and Klobuchar in Minnesota, and Bullock in Montana, and O'Rourke in Texas. And it's real small, but Warren has edged out support in Boston. So I was looking over this, and also like I looked over this, and I looked over some of the counties a little closer, and found a lot of interesting things to take away from it. And I'm going to go through kind of the stuff that I said about this. So one, to be a donor, you have to have one of two things. You have to have disposable income, and you have to have a level of enthusiasm for a candidate that's beyond just like a passing interest. You got to be like literally invested in that candidate, right? But compared to like popularity polls, which often like the horse race polls that you probably are more familiar with, Joe Biden is usually on top of those. But in opposition to that, compared to popularity polls, this shows that either the popularity polls are very, very wrong, and there are easy ways that they could be wrong. A lot of these polls are phone polls, and phone polls typically target landlines, which skews to an older audience, older people who have landlines, as an example. So those polls could be really wrong. Well, not really wrong, like 10% wrong, which I guess is a lot, actually. Based on who they're polling, which makes a lot of sense because I think that Sanders has a bigger generational gap in support than a lot of previous candidates. And on top of that, the other thing is that it could mean that maybe there's more support for Joe Biden, but that support is very unenthusiastic, which I think shows to something that I've been saying about the race since day one, which is since day one, I've been saying that there is a huge enthusiasm support for Sanders above any of the other candidates, which means that when it comes to the activities that are going to be necessary for primaries and for the general election and for caucuses, you're going to need to have enthusiastic volunteers and supporters. And right now, Sanders seems to have that well and beyond anybody else, which will translate into the things that win elections: volunteering, canvassing, being able to sit in a room for several hours during a caucus. Like, all of these things is a pretty big factors that make Sanders, even though being behind in horse race polls, the strongest candidate when it comes to the strength of the support base. The only places that don't support Sanders in a big way are in Texas, Wisconsin, Montana, Delaware, and D.C., which... which makes sense. And also, if you look at the map a little bit more in depth, you'll also see that there are stark divisions based on class. That, like, Buttigieg and non-Sanders candidates really do better in higher income neighborhoods, and then outside of them, they lose their support almost immediately, which I think is a big thing to point to. So it makes sense that most of these candidates are backing basically the candidate who represents their region. The only it also shows that California doesn't super support their supposed champion Kamala Harris, where everybody thought that Kamala Harris was going to be a shoo-in because she had the California primary on lock. But this shows a very different story, because California is not giving tons of money to, or not overall in support of Kamala Harris, which is interesting to say the least. But in DC, they're not. DC is where Sanders support is probably the lowest, and that is because of a couple things. One, the DC is a weird demographics region anyway. There's a lot of power brokers there, and a lot of people who are in what are called the professional class, which might not be billionaires, but they are definitely multi-hundred-thousand-aires who have jobs like lawyers and lobbyists and bureaucrats and things like that, who get paid very well. And on top of that, they're usually tied to a party. So what that means is they are literally invested in certain types of candidates winning. I think a lot of the power brokers in DC know for a fact that if Sanders becomes the presidential candidate or the president, that they will be out of their jobs, which is a scary prospect for people who make their living, trying to research those market-based solutions for figuring out how to effectively liquefy the poor into fuel. So they have actual things to lose in either influence or money if Sanders wins. So that's why Sanders support is real low in Washington, D.C. So there's a couple things to talk about this. Sanders has strong support, and the support from the kind of people who go to caucuses, who register for primaries, and in the general will go door to door getting out the vote. And this is very significant for what is considered the most left-wing candidate for president in my lifetime. I think that is significant in a way that people aren't really talking about enough. And also, he's doing well in states that are considered Republican strongholds. And also, he's the winner in all, I believe, of the key swing states. Like, he has almost unanimous support in Ohio. He has almost unanimous support in Florida. He has almost unanimous support in the American Southwest. All of these are key swing states, and not electing Bernie Sanders as the candidate will mean a huge blow to that region. Also, the states that went red in 2016 for the first time in a long time, like Michigan and Wisconsin, all are very big Bernie Sanders supporters, just like they were during the 2016 primaries. Oh, and Pennsylvania. Ugh. Forgot about Pennsylvania. Mustn't forget about Pennsylvania. So that is interesting. And also he does well in Republican led states. I think that that shows some interesting stuff. He's even polling highest in the in places like the Black Belt, which is parts of the South where there are high concentrations of black people. There's this whole mythology that black people don't like Bernie Sanders, but he polls better with people of color. He polls better with women than any other demographic. So this map shows that there's some serious issues with that as well. And I mean, we knew this was a bullshit fabrication that's a holdover from Hillary Clinton's election, but now I think it's even more solid. And the fact that, and this is another thing I think is really interesting, which is the United States, the division of candidates is a sign of something truly remarkable, which is Sanders. This is a thing that Sanders has been saying and that many people have been trying to draw attention to, but it's something that that none of the Beltway centristy corporate news sources want to talk about, which is that Bernie Sanders is more popular based on class lines. That is the strongest division. And there are more people who are not wealthy than people who are wealthy. But on top of that, if you think about presidential elections, if you go through the history of presidential elections, one of the most important things that basically make the parties the way they are is that parties really are they always are a big tent. You know, political parties are always a banded together alliance of different constituencies and interests, and they're all tied together loosely in order to get somebody over the line. One of the things that Trump did to win the last election is he got a constituency of people in the Rust Belt, specifically white people in the Rust Belt, to vote for Trump for the first time, or to vote Republican for the first time in a long time. And on top of that, Hillary Clinton just took the Obama coalition for granted. And that resulted in a huge surprise when she found out that a lot of people just came out and didn't vote for her. That she assumed she was going to get because they voted for Barack Obama. So there was a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama and then didn't vote in 2016, or people who voted for Barack Obama and voted for Trump in 2016, which is interesting people to look at. So Sanders not only has the possibility of winning those constituencies back, but to redraw the lines of politics in America based on class lines could be one of the biggest upsets in American political history. I know that sounds like big words, but hear me out. Very often in a crowded field like the one that we have now, you would expect the candidates to have different pockets of support based on what they've represented in the past, based on demographics, all sorts of stuff. But in this one, you see a very clear class representation and a very clear support from a lot of people who in the last few elections have sort of been written off because they don't vote. That is the coalition that Sanders shows promise of bringing together is not only one that could result in a landslide election at the Electoral College level, but one that could be, if the Democratic Party got on his wavelength, could extremely upset the American political order to the point where I would argue could even threaten the Republican Party for a generation. Because the Republican Party right now are using more and more exclusionary language. They're alienating more and more people. And the only thing they have going for them is this scapegoating of immigrants. And if Sanders manages to penetrate with the message that it's not immigrants that are breaking all these things, but it's your boss that's doing this, that it's capitalism that's doing this, that could be a huge change. I'd be very interested to see how that turns out. Dare I say, whisper a dream, that this could be the beginning of what class consciousness might look like. This shows that from a huge margin, America wants Sanders. They don't want neoliberalism. And if you want to give them, if you're going to use party mechanics, if you're going to try and use voter suppression to keep Sanders from winning the primaries, that is double down on a neoliberal candidate is to lose a huge chunk of Democratic Party support and a bunch of enthusiastic people. That would put the Democrats in position to be vulnerable to another Republican victory in 2020. And the narrative now is that choosing a right-wing candidate is somehow more electable, but these numbers show otherwise and really challenge that assumption. So, I would argue that right-wing Democrats, I know you really like the idea of letting poor people die for getting diseases, but if we're going to beat Donald Trump, you should get behind Bernie Sanders. It's the safe candidate. Was in 2016, y'all didn't listen, but you know what? Hindsight's 2020. That's my monologue on that. And of course, jeez. And of course, I also want to mention that there was, as I said, 2 shootings this weekend. Yeah, this fucking sucks. I wish they would stop. All right. Well, that was a whole lot of things I just said. We're already almost half an hour in, and I haven't even started answering the questions yet. So maybe I should start getting on that. First question here is, what are some side effects of cachaça? Can it actually improve my Fortnite prowess? Nothing can improve anyone's Fortnite prowess. Cachaça, well, there is one thing that can improve your Fortnite prowess, and that is natural male enhancement. Cachaça definitely can do that. So, to an extent, yes. By the way, none of that I said was true. Just so you know. I know that now I have a large enough audience that I have to make sure that nothing that I say ironically can be taken unironically by accident. What you said about bringing back First Nations, does that apply to other colonized parts of the world? If you lived in the UK, would you want to bring back pre-Roman Celtic states? Let's go with the ones that still have indigenous people alive today. Like, the UK's got a lot of, a mesh of people. Definitely it means that, get out of Ireland, get out of Scotland, but that's a much older story. I do think that indigenous people who are still alive today, these nations are still in existence. It's not like they no longer exist. Should be brought back into being the governing situation. I'm pretty sure most people in the US and Canada would be against being made citizens of a bunch of indigenous tribes. Doesn't that mean making them would be undemocratic? It was really undemocratic. Committing genocide on the indigenous people and taking their territory. So, which right do you think wins? You're obviously obsessing over this, so let's just go through it. Also, you're an anarchist. I thought you wanted no nation states, not just decolonized nation states. That is true. I do want no nation states, but I would definitely want decolonized nation states more than settler colonial states. But there's a difference between state and nation. There's also a difference between government and state. So you could definitely find a solution that is much, much more solid. Okay. What's next? What do you think is worse? People who genuinely love capitalism or people who think it's heavily flawed but the best system we have? People who genuinely love capitalism are usually just ignorant and using 1950s propaganda in place of how capitalism actually works. So, that's a thing. But when it comes to people who say it's flawed or the best system they have, that means they either are ignorant about socialism or they are benefiting from capitalism too much to do anything about it. So, in my mind, probably the latter is worse. All right. Man, I'm on a roll answering so many questions. Okay. Why do people still think that one must have a job in order to live? Ooh. All right. So why people still think that? Because people still, and I think that a lot of states try their best to maintain this thinking, which is that there's this idea, or that people are still primed to think that we are in some sort of economics of scarcity right now, because capitalism is so inefficient, we produce, it's been several decades since we've been able to produce more than the amount of things that people in the world need. And now we produce 40% too much stuff. We do 40% overproduction. We make 40% of stuff that just ends up being food that rots, things that get thrown in the trash that are perfect, completely unused, and make things that are disposable that don't need to be disposable, etc., etc., etc. So we are, as humans, primed to become extremely conservative when we think about threats to our existence or threats to our resources. So, keeping people thinking that there's not enough to go by, and so if there's not enough to go around, then we have to make sure that I get as much as I can. That's the way we think in emergencies, and it's not a thing that is true. in the objective sense, but you would not know it from the way that we talk about economics. And so if we were able to convince that there's plenty enough to go around, you don't have to worry about it, you'd get a lot less people who have this sort of reaction to the idea that, yeah, there are some people that can't work or can't work as much as others. And that's okay. We have more than enough to take care of you and them, so you don't have to worry about it. Let's see. I just realized I was like, I'm getting back into yelling. I was told myself I would stop yelling. Okay. What's next? Suppose VR tech gets to the point where it's as advanced as in shows like Black Mirror. Do you think people should be allowed to act out violent or sexual crimes in VR? Jeez, just get nothing but the hardest questions tonight. Okay. I would argue that is a complicated question that comes out of that would be better answered by a psychologist than a Tristan. Because this comes down to, like, the issue of, like... Because there's, like, a story that came out of Canada recently, which was that there was this guy who got busted because he was ordering from Japan these sex dolls that look like children. And at the time I was working for CCLA, and the position we had was that, you know, this is not harming anybody, so you should not make a stance. There is two ways that you could say to these things, and this is like the video game, do video games cause violence type situation. And also, like, there's a few psychological studies I probably want to talk through, and this would be more about whether or not the simulacra of doing said actions normalizes them to your to you in a way that is that is detrimental. Like, oh god, this is gonna get me in so much trouble. If like the effect of violent video games, which many studies have shown do not directly cause people to become more violent. This is granted. Does a culture that has violent video games, or like especially like extremely violent video games, does that cause a large amount of desensitization over a long period of time? Is the fact that video games are violent a threat? No. Is the fact that almost every video game is violent a little bit worrisome? Yes. I do think that the fact that it speaks to a culture that desensitizes us to violence, which won't cause you to become more violent, but will cause you to react less to acts of violence, which you could argue might be why we're like in forever wars, and we've become detached from the pain that other people are in. It's sort of like so like think about let's go with another example, another media example, which is the discussion of rape culture. And like in rape culture, we have through multiple cultural means normalized rape as a form of, or I shouldn't say rape. Rape is sexual coercion in general. Rape is too specific. But like normalized sexual coercion in a way that has normalized it and desensitized us to it culturally. So is that entirely out of the realm of possibility that is it entirely out of the realm of possibility that the non-stop, increasingly realistic and increasingly extreme violence found in mainstream video games may be a little worrisome? I don't know what the solution is to that, because obviously I think that if anything it's about encouraging more games that are more imaginatively diverse. Like the fact that every single AAA video game except for like The Sims is about violence is a tad wrong. But then I would think that if we had some like extremely realistic VR simulations of murder and sexual assault, that like most people wouldn't do it because it'd be too real until it was normalized. And then I don't know, I feel like normalizing going through the actions of doing those things would become an issue. Oh yeah, I have a cat in my lap that you guys want to see more than me. So on that note, I think that there's some things to worry about. But Gad Uriv said in the chat, and I think that there is some validity to it, which is that, you know, you would prefer that the pedophile, you know, sates their desires on like puppets or VR things than real children, which is like, yeah, I think that would be, I think that's pretty that's pretty true. But I would argue that somebody who has urges like that is obviously suffering from mental illness. And in those cases, when they would be using it, it would probably be some sort of therapy, some sort of supervised therapy, and not something that you would just sell as like a capitalist product. But like the other thing too of VR, and I think this is what might scare me the most, this is why video games and violence are especially something to worry about in the aggregate, because like right now video games are still they're still whatchamacallit, they're still abstracted, you know? You're pushing a button but not committing sexual assault or committing violence. But like I could imagine that there could, and even so, I think there's been desensitization to seeing violence that have come through various media sources, but video games included. I think that The biggest thing to worry about is if we had hyper-realistic VR simulations, because the act of actually killing somebody that's not abstracted through button presses and things like that, with like the little I know about how cognitive behavioral therapy works, could lead to some super damaging things to your mind. And that's why I would think that maybe we should be cautious about it when we cross that VR threshold. And that's why, like, if there was some sort of therapy for pedophiles and things like that, that it would need to be like approved and explicitly only done via the oversight of a trained psychologist. And in my mind, psychology could very well and very logically say that that therapy doesn't work and we shouldn't do it. And then I'd be for, not having them at all. Yeah. That's the way I would see that. I hope that has not made everyone hate me. Because I think that an uncharitable reading of what I just said could make you think that I hate violent video games, which I think is a too simplistic summary of what I said. Which is that I think there's a complicated back and forth that violent media in general, video games are in no way special, that I think that might say something. But I do think too that we are getting better, and that the indie video game scene has a lot more options for non-violent games than I've seen in a while, which I like a lot. But yeah. How are violent video games in any way equivalent to putting a bullet in someone's head? I don't think that they are. I just think that there's like I said, from what little I know about cognitive behavioral therapy, is that seeing people die in extreme and gruesome ways over and over and over and over and over again can exacerbate people who have certain forms of mental illness. Can exacerbate their symptoms. Or it can just make a culture that is desensitized to extreme violence, which gets a little real when we start doing that to real people. I hope you're not pathologizing sexual assault, since many mentally ill people are victims of sexual violence, and you don't have to be mentally ill to hurt others. This is true. I was speaking specifically about people who have I would argue, the pathological sexual desire for children, which is definitely something that is not good, and definitely something that should be worked through with a therapist if you are experiencing them. You're talking to Jonathan Sims. All right, so I hope that all the things I said made sense. I want to make sure, because I know that the topic of violence in video games is a touchy one for a lot of people. And yeah. And Gad Uriv has, you have that block, you have that chat that just got through, and I will say to you on that, which is, Tristan is not a psychopathologist, and not a psychologist of sex or anything. So I do not have anything valuable to say on the statement that you made. How can you argue with a dude holding a cat? Oh, man. So this is Phoebe. She's very, very chill right now. Being very... this is basically the position she has been in all day long as I've been making my video, so this is pretty normal for her. So you disagree with me on Robert Corbin. I also know that there was a lot of areas I said in there that I am not explicitly trained in and know a lot about. Because like a lot of the things when it comes to what's the effects culturally and psychologically of repeated exposure to violent media are not things that you take in history class. They are things you take in psychopathology and in media studies, which is not something that I have extensive training in. And so your guess is as good as mine in a lot of those things. All right. Okay, what's next? Luke Lee, Tristan, what do you think? What do you do when 30 to 50 feral hogs try to drink your cachaça? Oh, shit. Well, like, that's why you need your AR-15. If you don't have an AR-15, what's to keep 30 to 50 feral hogs drinking your cachaça within 3 to 5 minutes? It's a dangerous prospect, and you really can't be too careful with your cachaça. Cachaça is delicious, by the way. I don't know if you guys... It's hard to get outside of Brazil, so I know not a ton of people have had it, but it's nice. Oh, Dallas Robinson for the $10 super chat. Thank you so much. Giving me money because I like your stuff. That's it. Well, thank you, Dallas. That's very much appreciated. That makes me very... That makes that you're helping... You were literally putting food in this cat's belly. Because Step Back is my full-time career, and without and with your help, you help me keep my rent paid and keep these cats fed, which, you know, thank you. Appreciate it. Should we want the economy to crash well into Trump's office so that Democrats can run on that, or is that getting into accelerationism territory? Yeah, wanting the economy to crash during so that people hate Trump, and so that Democrat gets elected, does seem like you'd be hurting the poorest people. How do you do the super chat? There's a little on the chat thing. There's a little square with a dollar sign in it underneath the text box. You just click that. I would rather the poorest of not suffer because we want Trump to not be. Yeah. Okay. Did you hear that Gravel dropped out and endorsed Sanders? No, I didn't, but that doesn't surprise me. I don't think Gravel thought that he was going to... Gravel was not really running for president. He was just trying to get into the debate so that he could push Sanders more left-wing on foreign policy and stuff. So when Gravel... now that these two rounds of debates are done and the next one is going to have a higher bar to get in that Gravel's never going to be able to hit, that, yeah, it made sense that he would drop out at this point, since he was done since he was done, you know. Are Nobel Peace Prize winners the closest to real life superheroes? Really depends. The Nobel Peace Prize has sometimes not gone to the best of people, I should say, and so the Nobel Peace Prize sometimes goes to real life superheroes. Like I think I know that like she's like a boomer favorite, but I do honestly think that there's an amazing, like the work of Malala Yousafzai is actually like super impressive and pretty spectacular actually. And I think her Nobel Peace Prize is pretty well deserved. Barack Obama's? Maybe not. If elected president, do you think that Bernie would have the ability and the political will to use his power to free Lula da Silva? Oh my. I didn't think Lula da Silva was in prison. Is he? For anyone who doesn't know, Lula da Silva was like the left-wing president of Brazil for quite a while. Then he, basically until his term limits came up. But I know that there was a corruption scandal. But yeah, oh shit, yeah, he's in prison for it. He's in prison for the corruption scandal. That is not surprising. But then again, like if I remember correctly, with all the Glenn Greenwald stuff, that I imagine he'd be released with. So now that it turns out that a lot of that stuff was pretty sketchy, and it was basically trying to get the right back into power. That part of whenever that shakes out, Lula da Silva could probably get out, but yeah. All right, you're going away? Okay. She'll be back. She always comes back. Now we know Tristan doesn't watch the Majority Report. Sorry. I work on videos pretty much all of my waking time. That's why I don't get to watch a lot of things, especially things with the Majority Report, which are very long. Susie O, thank you very much for the $4.99 super chat. You are a freaking superhero. Susie O is a very strong supporter of Step Back. She's a patron. She's helped on PayPal a couple times. It's really Susie, you are a hero. You are the heroine of the night. Oh man, that really sucks, because Lula da Silva, and in the research I'm doing for this Brazil video, did a lot of really good things. Oh god. Yeah, there's a reckoning coming, because like the thing that brought Lula up on corruption stuff has recently been leaked, that like a lot of that stuff, especially the stuff that got President Rousseff impeached and stuff like that, is all very is all like kind of unraveling. I haven't followed up on. Is that why you didn't make a video on Lula da Silva? I'm working on a video that has a section of it on Lula da Silva right now. But the leaks that came out via Glenn Greenwald and company about the impeachment trial of President, I want to say her name's Dina Rousseff? No, something else. It starts with a D. Dila Rousseff? That sounds right. President Rousseff, like basically it turned out that the judge overseeing that whole corruption trial was more or less helping the opposition, or was helping the prosecution, and like was not a balanced judge at all is sort of as a way to put this like right-wing coup into the Brazilian government, which is like, slow motion put Bolsonaro in charge. If that shakes out in a positive way, I imagine Lula da Silva will probably get out of prison. Although, like, it's not the first corruption scandal he's been through, so who knows? But then again, he's done so many good things that you'd think that maybe something come through. This is all Brazilian politics, which I'm sure is super fascinating to the rest of you guys. Just the only reason I have a take on this is because I've been like living in Brazil world for like the last week and a bit. All right. Yeah. What is the best way Bernie can stay supporting rural gun rights while embracing gun reform? Won't critics say he's being contradictory? I mean, people already say that about him. He has said that there is a difference between different types of guns. I think that Canada's gun control laws are pretty solid, and I think that all of them are pretty common sense things that Sanders could support that would be considered extreme gun control to an American sense. But like banning assault weapons is not, unless you are a person who thinks that you're going to fight 30 to 50 wild hogs. Assault rifles are not a thing that Americans need. And also having a gun registry is also a good idea. None of those things are very like controversial for, like, they're not a thing that would screw over rural gun owners at the expense of urban people. Controls on handguns, for example, could also do that. Like, really, rural gun owners only really need like hunting rifles and shotguns for hunting and for dealing with like predators and things like that. But like, you don't need, so like a lot of gun control would be very, very solid for them. Let's see. Did ancient gift economies operate and the international scale and as well at the local level? Did the ancient Egyptians and Minoan Greeks exchange gifts or trade commodities? Very often, like, gifts and trade would be done as a form of diplomacy. But they were very much like, they factored on trade agreements, much more bartering than like straight up like currency stuff. I would argue that like gift economies, I would argue those aren't gift economies, and that the gift, like real, like legit gift economies have only really functioned at a small scale. I think that without the technology to manage a lot of things, it would be tough to do at a larger scale. I think it could be done with our technology we have today, but in ancient times, it might have been tougher. How likely are the new Indian administrative changes in Kashmir to start a war with Pakistan? How likely is it to go nuclear? That is something that that happened over the weekend, and I haven't. It's recent enough that the people who I like to read about India-Pakistan stuff haven't written their articles about it yet. And I know it's a huge deal because Pakistan and India are nuclear powers in a cold war with each other, and I would love to get to the bottom of what this means. But honestly, I don't know what it means. We're a little bit too early for that kind of stuff, or at least for me, because I don't really know. I'm not really super hip on India stuff, so I'd have to go and ask other people or read other things. My guess, though, is given that how excited Modi is about it, that it's probably going to be rather antagonistic towards Pakistan, which could turn into a nuclear disaster if things break down in just the right combination of ways. Yesterday you said you don't understand why people would become doctors if they don't want to help people. What about people who go into medicine to become cosmetic surgeons? From what I know, a lot of people don't go into becoming a doctor for becoming a cosmetic surgeon. It's a thing that they kind of come to later. I was talking to a doctor once, kind of said that like the specialty that they get into as doctors, they don't exactly do until late in their career. And typically it's based a lot on who you end up doing your co-op under. Cause like I went to go see this is like a long time ago. I went to go see a doctor for something to do with my foot. And I was like, how the hell does someone become a foot doctor? And he said like, oh no, it's just the thing I did when I did my thing, and kind of became its thing. But I would also say that I think Robert's got it on, is that cosmetic surgeons do help people. They there are people who go into cosmetic surgery because they want to help people who have been who have actually had horrible disfigurement, either because of birth defects or because of an accident or because of disease, and they want to help out. I am currently on the waiting list to see a cosmetic surgeon, because I'm getting this removed from the back of my ear. It's a little gross, sorry, but I'm getting that removed. And I think that there are altruistic reasons why people become cosmetic surgeons. Rather than history every Thursday, how about changing your tagline to history, politics, and cats? People really like the cats. Yes, I definitely need to change that because it's very outdated. If you guys know the YouTuber Nick Nimmin, I bought those graphics off of him. And so I'm probably going to change at some point. I'm working with, for anybody who is a regular in the Discord, I'm working with Discord moderator Birdie to commission new graphics for the channel sometime in the near future. So that's going to Aren't those plastic surgeons? Plastic surgeons and cosmetic surgeons aren't, I think they're pretty much the same thing. I'm going to get a well actually in just a second. I know it. Is that a tumor? Yes, it is a tumor. It is a benign tumor. I've had it for decades. It's because you know what? If it was cancer, I would have gotten it removed a long time ago. But it's not a threat to my life. It's just annoying and gross, and so therefore I have to wait a long time for a cosmetic surgeon to see it. The best way to explain anarchism to someone who is new to it in a format of 200 character limit. Oh boy. All right. I like the term to say that anarchism is the political philosophy that one needs to justify any form of hierarchy, and if they cannot, to replace said hierarchy with a non-hierarchical system. That's like the philosophical core of anarchism, and where you go from there is like very, it gets more philosophically dense from there. So like anarchists would say that given that one assumption, then given that assumption, the most anarchists come to the conclusion that the state is not a legitimate hierarchy and should be replaced with some sort of way of organizing society that's not hierarchical. Some don't. There are people who are I don't remember what they're called. I think they're called like minarchists or something like that, who believe the state should exist, but it should be very, very small, and very limited in what it can do. But yeah, that would be the anarchist. I would say that the other thing was probably, yeah. What's a good city in Canada where you can feel part of the community and not isolated? In the U.S., people tend to live scheduled lives without sharing much laughter or pain. What's a good... You can feel part of the community and not isolated? I don't know. I guess living in a city, but not a big one. Like, I live in the biggest city in Canada, but I have a feeling of community. I have friends. I have people that I can go and talk to. There are neighborhoods that I'm familiar with that I feel comfortable in. So I think that a lot of that stuff is a matter of perspective. I know that urban isolation is a pretty big thing, but I would think that if what you're looking for is like small town life, there's a lot of small towns in Ontario and Canada in general. Maybe like, I don't know, Sudbury? I don't know. Is Twitter or YouTube live chat the worst place to argue socialism versus capitalism? Isn't the character limit making it hard to explain anarchism to someone who is ill-informed? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Definitely is a challenge. Whether that makes it useless, but I wouldn't know to say to that. Is China socialist or capitalist? Yes. It's capitalist when it wants to justify there being poor people, but it's socialist when it wants to do gross overreaches of economic power in order to be on the big stage. I think they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics or something like that. It's a weird hybrid. I really don't think that there's an easy category to say that, but I would say that China is very much its own beast. Why are so many youths yearning for a return for working with hands/woodwork and living in a countryside off the land? Why do we romanticize lifestyles in general? Ooh, geez. I think a lot of youths are yearning for working with their hands and woodwork and things like that because more so in our generation than in previous generations, we're almost all knowledge workers and service workers. There's the amount of blue collar work that millennials is doing is lower than in previous generations, which I think, I think that there's a lot of strength in the psychology of like, you always desire the thing that you can't do. And so I think that a lot of people who find themselves working with their brain day in and day out have a strong desire to go back to doing something with their hands in their off time. And I imagine that that's also why people living in suburban, and a lot of millennials are moving into urban situations. Probably also, same idea is probably why they want to move to the country. I think that we always kind of like, thank you, Robert. You have a good night. Also, because people are talking about me doing collaborations with a cynical historian, I'm actually working on one right now, so it'll be coming out like later, like in December, but it is a thing that is happening right now. Let me see. Do you know about the Sino-Soviet split and its consequences? I know that it happened at one point. I know that China and the Soviet Union parted ways in like the 1960s, and I don't exactly remember. I don't exactly know the details about why. I'm sure as I keep writing for the Cold War, I'll eventually have to find out. So we'll get there. Where are we? How many people can actually change their mind on topics from online Twitter or YouTube debates like socialism versus capitalism? Don't more just change their mind when they do the research themselves? That's a good question. I think that there's some value to it. I do remember there's this one YouTube video from a guy who got out of the alt-right, and he writes a lot, or he talked a lot about how important like Destiny's streams and stuff were. And I think that that there is some value in getting things this way, because a lot of the ideas are, there's a lot of dense theoretical political science work that needs to get translated for general consumption. And a lot of people now are into like the media that they like to consume isn't books or even television or documentaries or anything like that. It's Twitter and live streaming. And live streaming comes with its own like media staples, like the personality driven streamer and all that kind of stuff. And so a lot of the times, a lot of that stuff can really is the way that people engage politically. Is it healthy? Well, that's an entirely different debate, but it is how people are doing it. And so when it comes to a lot of these things, I'd rather that stuff be there than not be there. That being said, I think it is extremely hard to change someone's mind. And it takes having the same arguments over and over again. It takes repeated exposure. It takes a lot of times, and sometimes, so very often, a lot of interactions with people who you disagree with will come across as fruitless, but it does eventually do stuff. And so that's a way that I would say that stuff, that all works. What's your favorite battle in... Oh, I skipped some, sorry. The conquest of North America was totally undemocratic, but does that make it justifiable to make the descendants of colonists give up their democratic rights to make it right? I don't think they'd be giving up their democratic rights. They would just be democratically involved in a different type of country, a different type of organizational structure. Many times, a lot of the ways that indigenous nations decide things, in Canada at least, are very, very democratic, to the point where they are consensus-based and require consideration of like the next 7 generations and things like that. So that, I think... And there have been governments, like official modern governments with chambers and stuff like that have been based on indigenous principles. And they've done well. A lot of the territorial governments work that way. So the question on what's my favorite battle? We'll get to that one. That one's further down. Sorry. We'll get to it. Don't worry. What ways do you think VR could make society better? Um, you know what's one of the big ways I think VR could make society better if we could actually make it work and work reliably for us? Is there's a couple things. There's one, remember that whole idea I mentioned? I think I've mentioned to you guys in a couple streams, and I've said it on Twitter and stuff, about how having face-to-face social interactions is healthy. I think that VR will... I think that a lot of the shittiness and toxicness of the internet that leads people to who predominantly interact with it to become unempathetic and to lack sympathy for fellow humans. I think it has to do with a lot of the abstraction that comes with text and with non-interactivity. I think that VR would be a good way to explore or to have an internet that is more based on a lot of the ways that human beings are primed to communicate that aren't necessarily well communicated on most of our social media platforms. You know, body language, tone, and things like that don't really make it across in a good way. And I think that there'd be we could have a lot richer conversations online in that sense. I think that it's harder to, in the sense that, like, it's harder to get into an argument with somebody face to face than it is online. I think it'd be harder to get into a fight with somebody in VR than it would like on Twitter. And I think that that would be good. Well, and the other thing I think also is that it would be good for what's it called? It'd be good for exploring different identities. I think a lot of times people are trapped from exploring different identities because of their physical, like because of either their bodies or because of their physical social circumstances. And I feel like VR would be a good way for people to explore new identities, try identities and not have to worry about fully committing. And things like that. I think that would that'd be good. I think that would be liberating for people. Where are we? All right, what is your favorite battle in history? Mine has to be Yarmouk. God. I'm struggling to think of a battle that I really like. I don't really know a ton about the things that happen at battles. I would probably say that the battle I know the most about is Gettysburg. But because I've written, this hasn't been published ever, but I have written a script for the YouTube channel Kings and Generals that involves the Battle of Gettysburg. And so I've done a lot of research on the Battle of Gettysburg. I've been to Gettysburg and I've seen where the battle happened. So maybe I should say the Battle of Gettysburg. It's also the battle where the Confederacy basically died, which I think is nice. Didn't like that it was so brutal and violent, though, but that's battles for you. To say that you... I think that the Battle of Tours is a interesting battle because of its... it, compared to a lot of other battles in history, has had a huge amount of significance over the rest of the world. Like, um, the Battle of Tours, I think, has had a massive impact on the world in a way that not many other single battles have. So there you go. You got 2. But in general, I don't find battles all that interesting. I know this might be off topic, but are there any other fascist movements outside of the West? Are there fascist movements in Asia or South America or Africa? Oh, there are tons. There are tons of fascist movements in those countries. Argentina has a very strong fascist movement. Argentina, there are fascist movements in Japan. There's yeah. All right. All right, so I have in big letters to cover this question. Kelly's basically like flashing it. Yesterday I told you that Rutger Bregman thinks that a medieval peasant would view our world as utopia. How do you think a medieval peasant would react to the level of sexual freedom in our time? I think that they would be probably pretty I don't know. Because, like, we have a concept of sexuality that is actually rather, like, medieval sexuality was, to an extent, I realize I'm very quickly going into territory that I don't know very well, so I'll be very careful about the things that I can have any sort of confidence about. But what I do know is that we typically think of approaches to sexual freedom as something that is very modern, but actually, like, a lot of what we think of, like, becoming prudish about sexuality and being very coy about it comes from only the Victorian age. And that a lot of sex had a very different connotation when you go kind of further back than, like, the 18th, 19th century. To the point where they didn't care as much about things like premarital sex and things like that, or whatever. Especially if you're a peasant. If you're a noble, it's a bit different, because then sex is related to inheritance and titles and bloodline, and wars could be started over these things. But if you're a medieval peasant, it doesn't really matter all that much. And so I would think that they would be... The first thing they'd probably think is that we're all very naive about love. They probably think that we act like teenagers. The fact that we marry for love and that we don't, like, just marry because our, parents thought it would make a good idea. I think that part would make them very... They would find it kind of goofy. It's kind of one of the things about Romeo and Juliet that kind of got lost to the ages. So Romeo and Juliet very much is about why love and marrying for love is kind of a dangerous thing that teenagers do, and kind of derisive of it. But a peasant would probably have some feelings like that. But for the most part, I think that you'd find them a lot less... probably find it less prudish than you think. You'd be, or at least I would be, prepared to be surprised. All right, mega question. What is the wild hogs thing about? Well, okay, let's talk about that. The wild hogs thing came from, so the shootings this weekend have prompted gun control discussions in the United States again. And someone made a tweet about wanting to put in an assault weapon ban. And then some guy, I think like a libertarian guy or something, said, serious question for rural Americans. What if I can't have assault rifles, what will I do when 30 to 50 hogs, feral hogs, come onto my property within 3 to 5 minutes where my small children are playing? Which, like, is a really strange edge case to support keeping around these weapons that kill people in massive numbers in the United States. So that's kind of that has just resulted in hogs showing up in all sorts of funny and weird places and making a big deal about hogs. When, like, I've learned afterwards that also assault rifles don't exactly hurt hogs, wild hogs, in a meaningful way, because their hides are too tough for the bullets, and that really, if you want to kill wild hogs, you have to, like, blow them up with shotguns. But on top of that, like, encouraging the hunting of feral hogs has also not significantly decreased their numbers. So a lot of the stuff he said is like, you know, BS if you, like, think about it for a little bit. But on top of that, just the meme space got completely taken over as we needed a distraction from all of the darkness of the shootings to make goofs about hogs. Okay. What are your thoughts on zoos? Do you think they are cruel to animals or not? I don't think so. They're not like circuses and things like that. Zoos tend to be like the park aspect of the zoo is the fundraising efforts for a lot of conservation practices. Like, it's certainly not a perfect arrangement, but the people who are running zoos are very different from the ones who, like, run, like, circuses and, like, SeaWorld and stuff like that. And very often zoos are about teaching kids conservation and about learning about these animals for biological purposes. And, like, there's all sorts of, like, scientific and conservation related benefits to zoos. There is a definite argument that there are animals that we keep in the zoo that we probably should not. But, yeah. On the subject of 30 to 50 feral hogs, I know I sometimes feel alone as a leftist who does believe in gun control. What are your thoughts on the U.S.'s mass shooting problem and guns? I'm totally on board with gun control. I'm not like a leftist who thinks that we should be hoarding guns. I don't think that if there was a weapon available that made the leftists in any way a threat to the military, so first of all, having access to assault weapons will just encourage people to try and LARP the 1917 revolution, which will always be a failure. But also, any weapon that could seriously threaten the stability of the United States would never be made legal. In my mind, the end of a rifle is not the way that we're going to have our leftist revolution. It's just not. If we try to fight the state on that battlefield, we will lose. And getting rid of assault weapons in the U.S. is a very easy way to reduce a lot of the people who die in these shootings. I think that there are, of course, deeper issues at play than just access to assault weapons for the issue about why America has so many mass shootings. Like the issue of right-wing white terrorism. But I do think that the assault rifle thing is a way to at least alleviate a little bit of the issue. What do you say to people who bring up the USSR as an example of communism failing? I would say that the USSR was an oligarchic dictatorship, and that having socialism without democracy is always going to be a failure, just like having capitalism without democracy is going to be an even bigger failure. And that the issue with the USSR wasn't the fact that it was communist, it was the fact that it was a dictatorship. Your thoughts on the dollar yuan economic downfall and falling prices on Wall Street? I know that China did devalued its currency as part of a way to flex its muscles at the United States, basically saying that the trade war is on, because it was basically a response to a tariff put on board by Trump. I think it's an incredibly dangerous dance that China and the U.S. are playing, and it could cause a lot of economic issues if it doesn't de-escalate soon. What makes pedophilia different from fetishes aside from the fact that it can't be acted upon without harming others? Desires aren't mental illnesses just because they're dangerous. My guess is that if you have a sexual desire that hurts other people, and you know that, and you acknowledge that, but you can't stop thinking about it, and you obsess over it, that is a sign to me that regardless of what your sexual orientation is or what your desires are, that there is an obsession angle to it, that you are willing to hurt someone else knowing you're hurting someone else in order to do that. On top of that, there's also a lot of, if you hear about the cases of a lot of pedophiles, they tend to adopt distorted thinking, specifically around rationalizing behavior, saying I did it because that 3-year-old was coming on to me, and it's like, oh god, it's like you hate to hear it, that's for sure, but that is a sign of distorted thinking, which does to me imply that there is something else going on as well. That's my guess. Because obsessive thoughts is a thing. Has the chat not moved in a while? Kelly? Am I on the air? Okay, okay, the chat is going okay. Good. Where are we? Okay. Let's see. Opinion on David Barton? I don't know who David Barton is. Have you seen Beau of the Fifth Column on gun control? No, I have not. What do you think about the Chapo Trap House subreddit getting banned from Reddit? I don't know. The Chapo Trap House subreddit can get kind of shitty sometimes, so Was there something specific that set it off, or is this some way to... Is this caving under pressure? I don't know. I don't really know too much about Reddit politics, so I can't really speak to it. All right. Would you consider the Iraq War to be ongoing despite its official end in 2011? Yes, it's just transitioned into forever war, permanent military installations and things like that. There's basically never going to be a real end to never going to be an end to the war on terror or the war in Iraq as part of that. Do you find the term state capitalist useful for describing China currently? Actually, that is a pretty good one. Honestly, I'm not a super big expert on China, and so I can't really speak to how it works. It's not my expertise, but I've heard state capitalism as a way to talk about China. Is there any truth to the stigma that leftists, anarchists, and punks are social outcasts who desperately cling to anything that will give them identity? I don't think that that's true of leftists, anarchists, and punks. I think that's true of young people. And leftists tend to be students and young. So I would say that it's a thing about young people, not like specifically any political segment. What else? What do you think of edgy leftists like Vaush? I think that they're mean and that I don't want to associate with them. Should the Second Amendment be repealed in the United States? I think the entire Constitution should be repealed and replaced with something that wasn't drafted in the 18th century. I often think that the left is missing a huge opportunity in not utilizing liberation theology and other attempts to pull in Christian voters. They're a huge voting bloc. Thoughts? Yeah, I think liberation theology is great. It's a great way to great movement within Christian circles, and I wish that more people were doing it. We need more Christian socialists. I think that it's a very easy argument to make. I think there's a very easy reading of Christian doctrine that is very, very socialist. The pros and cons of Canada joining the United States. Well, the pros of Canada joining the United States would be that we would get probably a major economic boom. Actually, would we? Maybe not. There's a lot of downsides. There's the fact that we would lose what little identity we have left. We would have basically no control over a lot of what happens to us because we'd be subsumed under the American federal system, which would include all the massive gains we've made over the years, like a healthcare service and being peacekeepers instead of global police people. So those are the cons. The pros, I guess, we wouldn't have to be associated with the monarchy anymore. That'd be nice. That's it. The NDP be a major player in U.S. politics. I don't think that's true. I think the NDP would not be able to survive a transition to U.S. politics. There's not enough of them. The entire country of Canada has a population that is less than the state of California. So Canada would not be a very important, the Canadian provinces would not individually be very important states. Maybe Ontario and Quebec would be considered reasonably large states, but not super, super important. If mass shooters are rehabilitable and are unlikely to be repeat offenders, should they get short sentences, or do victims need for closer justify long sentences? You know me. I am a prison abolitionist, And I think that even mass shooters should finding a path for them to make amends for the horrible thing they did and make sure that they are not that they're not going to hurt others. I think deprogramming and getting them out of whatever dark, twisted hole made them commit such a horrible crime, and then trying to get them to become a redeemed person should be the number one priority. I don't believe in the victims need to sate their bloodlust or their revenge. I think that's not a healthy way to think about justice. Which is the most class-supporting socialist province or city in Canada? You might get, I think, British Columbia, maybe Quebec. One of those two, I'd probably say. Saskatchewan used to have it, but Saskatchewan's kind of lost it over the years. I'd probably say BC would probably be closer. Have you ever wanted to wear a cloak? I don't think so. Should humans live in very uninhabited wild spaces? Shouldn't we reduce our impact on nature by keeping nature humanless and concentrate humanity in cities? Yes. You are right, Gad. I completely agree. I think that humans should live in 2 mega cities, and that's it. And let the rest of the world just recover without us. If I had our perfect dream, I would want us to live in space and for the Earth to not have humans on it, so that we can rebuild, so that nature can reassert itself. With regard to the peasant question, I'm always curious about how a medieval peasant would view revealing clothing in the modern world. That, unfortunately, knowing the psychology of people 1,000 years ago is pretty much impossible. And the best people who could make guesses about it would be medievalists, which, as someone who is not a medievalist, like myself, I would have very little use to actually say to that. What do you think if there are 30 to 50 feral hogs on your yard? Well, I don't know if you know, but I was going to try to recreate the Neil deGrasse Tyson tweet that I did earlier. While that is a tragedy, we lose 420 people every 3 to 5 minutes to Fortnite-related diseases and 69 to weed overdoses. So, oftentimes, things can be dramatic, but that overlooks the data. Let's see. What's the longest trip you've ever taken? 3 weeks. 3 weeks was the longest trip I've ever been on. It was in the summer of 2002, and it was a road trip through the American Southwest. I was 13. I remembered it well because that was the year that the Game Boy Advance came out. And on that trip, I played a lot of the Castlevania that came out when the Game Boy Advance first came out. Yeah. I think it was called Circle of the Moon, I think was the Castlevania game that I played a lot of. How will development in 3D printing change the economy? Oh boy. Personalized manufacturing, I think, is the big difference. the idea that we are going to, if 3D printing gets to the point where we think it's going to get to, that we could replace, mass manufacturing with personalized manufacturing, which would mean that we could cut down on overproduction, we could cut down on one-size-fits-all type stuff and make everything customized for individuals, that we could 3D print more replaceable parts so that things could have longer shelf lives. So there's a lot of that could completely revitalize the economy. When is that going to happen? I'm not sure, but I could see that being a big thing. Okay. Suppose letting people kill or rape in VR might cause damage. Don't you think there's a freedom argument for letting people do it anyway? Maybe. Hopefully I don't have to be the person who makes that decision is my answer. Should the USA follow Canada instead of the other way around? That wouldn't be a bad decision. Apropos monarchy, do you think that a post-Brexit Britain would ever shut off the monarchy? No. I think that maybe a lot of other countries will shut off the monarchy because of the diminishment of the UK that's coming up. Let's see. Thoughts on the Young Turks as in the progressive media outlet? They're okay. They're a little soft in their convictions for my taste, but they're better than what is on television, so that's good. News sources would you recommend for anarchists to consume? What news sources do you trust? I don't trust any singular news source. I would trust, like, Democracy Now! Is a pretty solid news source, but really my whole thing is I don't really trust any news sources, and in my mind, I will only, like, really believe something if I've seen it from multiple sources, and multiple sources that are not necessarily capitalist ones. So it takes a lot of work. So typically I'll read a whole lot of news sources. There are some that I particularly don't trust. Like, I think that some, like the Washington Post, are, like, especially bad. I think that Fox News is especially bad. I think that some, like, CNN can be very bad, but like, they still do a lot of work that you can, like, at least get some ideas from. But for the most part, their analysis is pretty terrible, and their worldview skews a lot of their reporting. Hence why you need to get multiple sources. Would we get to leave megacities to hike in wild places? Not being able to do that would be pretty bad from mental health. I don't see why that would be a problem. How would we best keep order and prevent crime in megacities? The same, I don't know. I don't think that the idea of megacities creates crime. I think that capitalism creates crime. I think that states and inequality and desperation create crime. So if we can address those things, then I think we'd be in a good space. Other than keeping order, they'd probably have to have a whole sort of system of different types of regulatory bodies and things like that. Just because you're an anarchist doesn't mean you're against rules. You're just against rulers. And I think that you could probably argue for a pretty legitimate hierarchy. There's a pretty legitimate hierarchy in, like, making sure that the roads follow a certain standard so that people don't crash into each other. How to talk to your grandparents about politics without losing your temper. Being patient. realizing that they grew up in a different context than you did, and so their base assumptions are very different from the ones you grew up with. And so in order for them to change their minds, it's going to take many more conversations than just the ones you have. Why are you quoting Neil deGrasse Tyson? Wasn't he accused of rape? I think he was accused of sexual assault, or not sexual assault, sorry, sexual harassment. I don't know where things went from there. But Neil deGrasse Tyson sucks for a number of other reasons too. In my tweet that I did, I was definitely mocking the shitty Neil deGrasse Tyson tweet that he did over the weekend about the shootings. Like, let me find. Neil deGrasse Tyson did a shitty tweet where he basically was like, people die from medical malpractice and the flu and stuff, so you shouldn't be as, charged up about this mass shooting just because it's dramatic. And everyone was like, this is, the most tone-deaf thing I've ever read. And I made a joke about it. I made a parody tweet related to the 30 to 50 hogs. Bernie has 3.4 million followers on Instagram while Warren has 1.4. Does this mean Bernie will get more votes? Yeah, I think in general, outside of the kinds of people who answer phone polls, Sanders has way more support with, regular people than Warren does. Just because more people have heard of him because he ran for president last time. I think he's got a lot more instant name recognition than Warren does. Warren's ideas are kind of like milquetoast and they're whatever. But I think that there's also weaknesses in the her electability platform. She doesn't have the pre-existing volunteer base. She doesn't have the enthusiasm, that kind of stuff. Why don't they ever talk about the massive amounts of shooting in urban areas? 14 people got shot on Father's Day in Philly. Doesn't see a peep nationally. It's because a lot of those are either they're either not considered quote unquote mass shootings because less than 4 people died. I think 4 is the criminal level on that. But on top of that, those have a very clear and distinct cause. They're caused by crime. They're caused by gangs and stuff like that. And a gang shooting is less it's more understandable than say when a white guy decides that he doesn't like brown people, so he drives to El Paso, Texas to murder a bunch of them. There's a different thing going on about these people who, for one reason or another, go to a specific place to kill random people in a mass amount of violence, while a crime-related shooting is while you might not agree with it, you can at least understand it. Yeah. When I was a kid, my grandfather said something like, if India was as advanced as us, they wouldn't still be poor 60-odd years after we left. What, if anything, do you do about that? I mean, you could always just say, there's a lot, you're skipping over a lot of nuance there, Grandpa. What is even the point of that thing you just said? I would just be if someone said that to me, I'd just be like, what is the point of the statement you're making? Are you trying to say that there's something about Indian people that just makes them less advanced? And if so, how do you justify that? How do you, what mechanism causes that? I would also reply by saying, India India got its independence, but India started far behind everyone else. The fact that India has been able to develop as much as it can in 70 years or 60 odd years, that is super impressive. Like, India has a fucking space program. Like, it's pretty, the things that India's been able to do have been pretty impressive. And even so, it's a country of 1 billion people that was not developed by the English very much at all, and was optimized just for resource extraction. Like, bringing a country back to life after all of that is, or bring a country up to first world standards when first world countries have centuries of exploiting the resources of the entire world of legacy to get on. Like, it ignores context, it ignores circumstance, ignores everything. You have, like, it's a very weak argument that they would make. Should I watch Babylon 5? I've watched some Babylon 5. I think it's a pretty good show. There's a couple things about Babylon 5. So one, it's a 90s show. 90s sensibilities. It might grate on you a bit. It's not that bad, but it is a 90s show. It has 90s like TV conventions and stuff like that. Two, Babylon 5 adopted 3D really before, like 3D graphics really before it was ready. And so the space scenes all look like 90s video games. It's funny, and it's kind of a thing you're going to have to put yourself past. But if you can put yourself past the really, really like the cringy CGI and the 90s plot conventions, it's actually like secretly one of the most like solid science fiction shows. It's got a great serialized plot. It's got amazing like political intrigue. It has amazing world building. And so if you give it your energy, then you'll be rewarded quite a bit. All right, it is 8:58 and I have to get back to editing my video. So I'm going to finish off with that. But you guys, this has been a great little stream. I'm sorry I can't go on for another hour. I really need to work on this video. I'm already going to be pulling like an all-nighter as it is. So thank you all. I hope that you guys got happiness out of your questions. And after 3 days in a row of streaming, I'm definitely in need of a nice break. But I'll see you guys all on Monday. So have a good week, guys. Love each other, etc.